April 27th, 1945. The morning air hung thick with the smell of burned wood and wet earth. In a makeshift prisoner of war camp near the Belgian border, frost still clung to the barbed wire fences, catching the pale light of dawn. The camp had been erected hastily in the final weeks of the war, thrown together with whatever materials the advancing Allied forces could salvage from the wreckage of the Third Reich. Canvas tents sagged under the weight of spring rain. Wooden posts leaned at odd angles, and in the centre of it all, arranged in rows like forgotten cargo, sat nearly 300 German prisoners. Among them was Helena Richter, a woman of 32 years whose hands bore the marks of factory work and whose eyes carried the weight of a nation's collapse. She sat on the cold ground, with her back against a support post, iron shackles binding her wrists together. The chains were old, rust-eaten things salvaged from some Wehrmacht supply depot. They clinked softly whenever she moved, a sound that had become as familiar to her as breathing. Around her, other women sat in similar states of restraint. Some stared at nothing, others whispered prayers. A few slept sitting upright, too exhausted to care about comfort anymore. The British guards moved through the camp in their heavy coats, their boots squelching in the mud. Most of them were young men, barely 20 years old, their faces still carrying the shock of what they had seen in the final push through Germany. They had liberated concentration camps. They had walked through villages reduced to ash. They had seen things that would wake them screaming for decades to come. And now they were tasked with guarding the defeated, the remnants of the machine that had nearly consumed the world. Private Thomas Ashford stood at the edge of the camp, his rifle slung over his shoulder, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of grey and pink. He was 23 years old, from a small village in Yorkshire, and he had been on the continent for nearly 2 years. He had fought through Normandy, survived the winter offensive in the Ardennes, and crossed the Rhine when everyone said it was impossible. And now, in these final days of the war, as Hitler's bunker smouldered in Berlin and the Nazi Empire crumbled into dust, he found himself standing guard over people who looked more like victims than villains. This was the complicated arithmetic of war's end. The messy tallying of guilt and innocence that never quite balanced the books. The prisoners in this camp were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were factory workers, administrators, nurses, and clerks who had been swept up in the chaos of Germany's collapse. Helena had worked as a secretary in the Reichsarbeitsdienst, processing paperwork for infrastructure projects in occupied France. She had typed requisition forms for concrete and steel. She had filed reports on bridge construction and road repairs. She had never held a weapon. She had simply done her job, trying to survive in a world where survival meant not asking too many questions. When the Wehrmacht finally collapsed in mid-April, she had been caught in a sweep of civilian detentions, processed as an auxiliary member of Nazi administration, and shipped to this camp. The irony was not lost on her. She had spent the war filing papers that helped build the infrastructure of occupation. Now she was the occupied. The chains on her wrists were heavy, but not as heavy as the knowledge that she had been part of something monstrous, even if her part had been small and distant and wrapped in the mundane language of bureaucracy. The practice of shackling prisoners was not universal, but it was not uncommon either. In those chaotic final weeks, as the Allied advance swept across Germany faster than supply lines could follow, makeshift camps sprang up everywhere. The shackles that bound Helena and the other women were relics from a Wehrmacht prison transport, distributed to this camp because proper restraint equipment had not yet arrived. They were meant to be temporary. But temporary had already stretched into 3 weeks. Ashford had been assigned to this camp 3 days earlier. His unit was being rotated back for rest before the expected invasion of Japan. For now, he was on guard duty, which mostly meant standing around and making sure no one tried to escape. Not that anyone seemed inclined to try. The women were exhausted, defeated, and had nowhere to go anyway. Germany was a smoking ruin. On his second day, he had watched the women line up for food rations, shuffling forward with their chains clanking, holding out tin cups for watery soup and stale bread. He had seen the way they avoided eye contact, the way they flinched when guards shouted orders. He had expected to feel anger toward them. He had expected to see monsters. Instead, he saw people who looked like his mother, his sisters, his neighbors back home. That night, he had written a letter to his mother that he never sent. In it, he tried to explain the cognitive dissonance of guarding people who were technically enemies but looked like victims. He tried to describe the moral vertigo of standing on the right side of history while watching the defeated suffer. But the words would not come right. He tore up the letter and wrote a different one instead, full of cheerful lies about how he was doing fine and would be home soon. The historical record of prisoner treatment in the aftermath of World War II reveals a complicated picture. Estimates suggest that between 2 and 4 million German civilians were held in Allied camps between 1945 and 1948. Some were genuine war criminals who deserved prosecution. Others were low-level functionaries whose guilt was more ambiguous. The camps varied wildly in conditions, from well-organized facilities with adequate care to nightmares of overcrowding and neglect. The shackles had been distributed after an incident in a nearby camp where prisoners attempted to escape. The order had come down from distant headquarters. High-risk personnel were to be restrained. The definition of high risk was vague. In practice, it meant anyone the local commander decided should be shackled. In this camp, it meant all women who had worked in any administrative capacity for the Reich, not because they were dangerous, but because someone somewhere had filled out a form that said they should be. This was how empires crumbled, not in grand battles, but in the mundane cruelty of bureaucratic momentum. In orders followed without question, in forms filled out by tired clerks who had stopped thinking about what their paperwork meant. On the morning of April 27th, Private Ashford walked through the camp on his routine patrol. The sun had burned off the early frost, and steam rose from the wet ground. He passed rows of sitting prisoners, most silent, some praying quietly in German. He had picked up a few words of the language. Brot meant bread. Wasser meant water. Bitter meant please. These were the words of need, the universal vocabulary of the defeated. He stopped in front of Helena, who sat with her back against the post, her chained hands resting in her lap. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, her blonde hair hung limp and dirty around her face, but her eyes, when she looked up at him, were clear. Not defiant, not pleading, just clear, human. He looked at her chains. Then he looked at the other women, all shackled, all sitting in the mud. And something in him simply broke. Not broke in the sense of collapsing, but broke in the sense of breaking free. He had been carrying the weight of what he had seen for so long. The bodies in the concentration camps, stacked like cordwood. The hollow-eyed survivors who could barely stand. The German guards who claimed they had just been following orders. He had carried it all, and he had told himself that it was righteous, that the Germans deserved their suffering, that justice demanded retribution. But looking at Helena in her chains, he could not maintain that certainty. She was not an SS officer. She was not a camp guard. She was a woman who had typed papers at a desk, who had been caught in the machinery of history and ground up like everyone else, and she was chained like an animal. He knelt down in front of her. She flinched, expecting a blow or harsh words. Instead, he reached for his belt and unclipped the keyring that held the master key for the shackles. Helena stared at him, uncomprehending. Around them, other prisoners began to notice. Private Ashford inserted the key into the lock on Helena's shackles. The mechanism was stiff with rust and disuse. He had to work it back and forth, jiggling the key, applying pressure. Helena held perfectly still, as if any movement might cause him to change his mind. The lock clicked open. The sound was small, barely audible over the ambient noise of the camp, but in that moment, it seemed to echo across the entire compound. The shackles fell away from Helena's wrists, landing in the mud with a dull thud. She brought her hands up slowly, staring at them as if they belonged to someone else. Her wrists were ringed with bruises and raw skin where the iron had chafed. For a long moment, no one moved. The other prisoners watched in silence. And Private Thomas Ashford, 23 years old from Yorkshire, who had seen too much death and carried too much rage, looked at the woman he had just freed, and understood that this small act of mercy would haunt him for the rest of his life. Not because it was wrong, but because it revealed how much else had been wrong. How many other people sat in chains they did not deserve? How many orders had he followed without questioning? How much suffering had he witnessed and accepted as necessary because it came with the moral clarity of victory? Helena rubbed her wrists gently, her eyes never leaving his face. She did not smile. She did not thank him. But something passed between them, a recognition of shared humanity that transcended the uniforms they wore and the sides they had been on. The silence in that part of the camp stretched out, heavy and profound. Other prisoners craned their necks to see what was happening. Guards began to notice. A sergeant started walking toward them, his face already forming a question. And then Private Ashford stood up, turned to the next woman in line, and unlocked her chains too. He had not thought through the consequences when he unlocked the first set of chains. He had simply acted on impulse, driven by a sudden clarity that this was wrong. But once he started, he could not stop. The second woman, then the third. Each time, the same small click of the lock, the same dull thud of iron hitting mud, the same look of stunned disbelief. Other guards were running toward him now. The sergeant was shouting his name. But Ashford kept moving down the line, his hands working the key mechanically. He had unlocked 7 sets of shackles before Sergeant Davies reached him and grabbed his arm. Davies spun him around, his face red with anger and confusion. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Private?" Ashford looked at him steadily. "They don't need to be chained, Sergeant. They're not going anywhere. They're not dangerous. That's not for you to decide. You have orders. Orders to chain women who filed paperwork? Orders to treat them like criminals when we don't even know what they did?" Davies looked at the freed prisoners, then at the ones still shackled. His grip loosened slightly. He had seen the same things Ashford had seen. He had walked through the same concentration camps. But he had been a soldier long enough to know that discipline mattered, that one man's conscience could not override the chain of command. Captain Morrison emerged from his tent, buttoning his jacket as he walked toward the disturbance. He was a logistics officer who had been given command because someone needed to do it. He was not prepared for moral dilemmas. But here he was, walking across a muddy field toward a situation that had no easy answer. When he reached them, Davies saluted and began to explain. Morrison listened, his face carefully neutral. Then he looked at Ashford. "You removed the restraints without authorization?" "Yes, sir." "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Ashford looked at the freed prisoners, then at the ones still shackled. "These women aren't soldiers, sir. They're not war criminals. They're people who got caught up in something bigger than themselves. Chaining them doesn't serve any military purpose, it just makes us cruel." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. The entire camp seemed to be holding its breath. He had joined the army in 1942 after his brother died at El Alamein. He had spent 3 years trying to keep the machinery of war running. He was not a combat soldier, but he had seen enough to know that war changed people, that it ground down morality into something sharp and jagged, and that somewhere in the process, you had to decide what kind of person you were going to be. He looked at the women still in chains. Then he looked at Ashford. "Sergeant Davies, collect all the shackle keys from the guards. Remove the restraints from all prisoners in this section. We'll report this as a command decision based on security assessment." Davies blinked. "Sir?" "The private is correct. These restraints serve no military purpose. Remove them." There was a collective exhale across the camp. Davies hesitated only a moment before saluting and turning to carry out the order. Morrison looked at Ashford. "You're confined to quarters pending review. Dismissed." The rest of that morning, guards moved through the camp removing shackles. The sound of locks clicking open became a rhythm, a percussion of small liberations. One by one, the prisoners were freed from their chains. They sat rubbing circulation back into their hands, staring at their wrists as if seeing them for the first time. Some cried quietly. Others sat in stunned silence. The transformation in the camp was subtle but profound. The chains had been a symbol of how far they had fallen, a physical manifestation of their status as less than human. Their removal did not erase that status, but it acknowledged that they were still people, still deserving of basic dignity. For the guards, the change was equally significant. They had been taught to see the Germans as the enemy, as the architects of unspeakable evil. But these women, sitting unchained in the mud, complicated that narrative. They were not monsters. They were not heroes. They were something more difficult to categorize, ordinary people who had made ordinary compromises in extraordinary times. The question of complicity would haunt Germany for generations. How culpable was the secretary who typed deportation orders? The nurse who treated soldiers? The administrator who processed requisitions? Where did responsibility begin and end? These questions had no easy answers, no clear, bright lines separating guilt from innocence. Private Ashford spent the rest of that day confined to his tent, writing another letter to his mother that he would not send. "I don't know if what I did was right," he wrote. "I don't know if these people deserve forgiveness or punishment or something in between, but I know that chaining them was wrong. I know that we have to be better than what we're fighting against, or else what's the point?" He stared at the words for a long time, then folded the letter and put it in his pocket alongside the other unsent letters. Some things could not be explained to people who had not been there. Some burdens could only be carried alone. Captain Morrison did not punish him. The official report stated that the restraints had been removed as a command decision. There was no mention of insubordination. Morrison had decided that sometimes the rules needed to bend, that blind adherence to protocol could be its own form of moral failure. The camp continued to operate for another 6 weeks. In early June, the prisoners were processed and released. Helena Richter was classified as a low-level functionary, required to attend denazification proceedings, but not charged with specific crimes. She returned to what remained of her home in Bavaria, to a Germany that no longer existed in any recognizable form. She would live another 40 years, working as a secretary again, this time for American occupation authorities, then later for the West German government. She would marry, have children, and watch as Germany rebuilt itself from the ashes. And sometimes, in quiet moments, she would rub her wrists and remember the morning a British soldier removed her chains while the whole camp fell silent. She would remember the sound of the lock clicking open, the weight falling away, the sudden recognition that even in the machinery of war and defeat, there was still room for individual acts of conscience. Private Thomas Ashford returned home to Yorkshire in August 1945. He worked at a textile mill for 40 years, married his childhood sweetheart, and raised 3 children. He rarely spoke about the war. The medals he earned sat in a drawer, unregarded. But he kept all those unsent letters, bound together with string, hidden in the back of a closet where his wife found them after he died in 1989. She read them all, these letters full of doubt and moral anguish, these attempts to explain the unexplainable. And she understood for the first time the weight her husband had carried all those years, the burden of having seen too much and knowing too much about the complexity of human nature. In his final years, suffering from cancer, he told his daughter about the incident. "I don't know if I did the right thing," he said. "Maybe those women deserved their chains. Maybe I should have followed orders. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were becoming what we had fought against, that in our anger at what had been done, we were losing sight of what made us different from them in the first place." The camp where these events took place no longer exists. The tents were struck, the fences removed, and the land returned to agricultural use. There is no memorial, no historical marker. The historical record mentions the camp only briefly in logistics reports. Dry accounts of prisoner numbers and supply requisitions that say nothing about the human experiences contained within those statistics. But in the vast archive of the war's aftermath, in the millions of individual stories that made up the final chapter of World War II, the moment when a British soldier removed a German woman's chains remained significant precisely because it was not unique. All across occupied Germany in those final months, Similar moments played out. Guards who decided to show mercy. Commanders who bent the rules. Small acts of conscience that pushed back against the machinery of collective punishment and revenge.